Resident Evil 7 is one of the first and best titles to support the original PlayStation VR. The extra immersion made possible by the headset elevated the experience to a new level, but fundamentally, the game itself differed only in terms of its presentation. RE7 is still built around the DualShock 4, offering controls very much in line with the flat-screen version of the game. Now, years later, Capcom has introduced VR support for its sequel, Resident Evil Village, but this time they've managed to embrace the new Sense controllers, which fundamentally alters the core gameplay. It's now possible to play through the entirety of the game using hand tracking, leading to a distinctly new experience. Bearing in mind the visual target and the original controller-driven design though, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that this new VR mode would actually deliver. After all, part of what makes games like Half-Life Alyx so immersive lies in it being designed from the ground up for full-body movement. So today I'd like to examine two facets of RE Village's update. Firstly, how do the visuals hold up in VR, and what sacrifices were necessary to get there? Secondly, how do the new Sense controls influence the experience? Let's dive in. To begin with, the VR mode in Resident Evil Village has been added to the game via a downloadable patch and a content pack. Once installed, you can engage VR mode by simply starting the application. You'll be asked if you want to play in VR when booting the game. That's right, the VR mode is a completely separate option from the main game. It features its own saves and lacks support for any trophies, which could be disappointing for folks waiting to play the game for the first time. Once you begin, you'll be presented with the game's introduction video within a bordered floating screen. This is how cutscenes were presented in Resident Evil 7. But once it switches to real-time graphics, the game transitions to full stereoscopic 3D. You can experience the game's cutscenes in proper VR. But there's a caveat. These sequences have predefined camera movement and animation, which is disconnected from your actual movement. This can trigger motion sickness in some users, but there's an option for this. If you pause any cutscene, Capcom allows you to disable stereoscopic 3D for these sequences, allowing you to view them within a floating screen, much like RE7. Once you're handed control then, you'll immediately notice the shift in visual quality and control, and I'd like to start by discussing those visuals. So Resident Evil Village has always been a fantastic looking game, and on the newer consoles, it even offers a ray tracing option. As you'd expect, however, the VR mode does not utilize ray tracing, no surprise there, but it is interesting to see how the game has been translated into VR. In its original form, the game runs at a stable 60 frames per second as long as ray tracing is disabled, and that seems to be the case here as well. Now, we can't measure the frame rate of VR content yet, owing to the way the social screen works, but to my eye, it's very clear that the game updates at 60 frames per second while relying on asynchronous time warp for head movement. That means your head movement will appear to update at a full 120 Hz, but the game world and rendering are all updated at half rate. This can lead to the same double image effect I've noted in other videos. Image quality wise, however, the shift to stereoscopic 3D certainly has a noticeable impact. It's very clearly running at a much lower resolution than the base game viewed on a flat panel display. Looking at the comparisons, note how much wider the FOV is when using VR. I'd imagine this is a necessity to simulate what our eyes would see when viewing stereoscopic 3D. The non-VR mode also features washed out black levels by default, but this can be corrected by the options menu, so it's not a big deal. Honestly, side by side, the VR mode holds up surprisingly well against the pancake mode. Now, Village does use eye-tracked foveated rendering to ensure that pixel density remains highest according to the position of your eyes, so that means the countable pixels vary across the image. The good news is that while it does take a hit to clarity, it's still vastly sharper than Resident Evil 7 on the original PSVR, as you'd expect. Honestly, revisiting RE7, I was kinda surprised at just how poor the image quality really is, especially their attempt at foveated rendering on the left and right side of the screen. It's pretty awful. In fact, revisiting the PSVR1 headset reminded me just how much better the PSVR2 truly is. The headset is much less comfortable, the lenses are prone to fogging, the FOV is super narrow, the screen is low resolution, and the black levels are very poor. It was good for 2016, but yeah, we've come a long way. That said, in certain scenes, specular aliasing can be extremely bothersome, creating visible shimmering and flickering on bright edges, so it's kind of a mixed bag there. Despite the loss in image quality, however, the rest of the visual fidelity is retained and the game looks pretty much just as good as you remember. The environments are all still beautifully detailed and a delight to explore in full VR. In fact, I've often found that VR is most immersive when exploring smaller, cramped spaces, and Village has plenty of them. Beyond this, the headset's ability to handle a deeper contrast pays off big time, especially in darker scenes, which can now appear truly black. Walking around beneath the castle, the increase in tension is palpable in VR mode. This is one of my favorite enhancements, in fact, as with most other headsets, black levels were often raised to reduce smearing, and that's much less of a problem here on PSVR2. Of course, even with this headset, there is a downside, as it does reveal some of the underlying image grain visible within the OLED panel. I noticed this more in RE Village than any other game too, so keep that in mind. The translation of visuals to VR is certainly interesting though. Lady Dimitrescu was always an imposing figure, but in VR her sense of presence is downright disturbing. She's gigantic. And that's in sharp contrast to RE7 in VR, where I always felt the characters were scaled strangely, appearing almost inhumanly small. That's definitely not the case here. The scale of the world and the characters now feels a lot more natural. Of course, switching to stereoscopic 3D has some drawbacks, such as the reliance on cube maps for reflections. In stereoscopic 3D, it now truly does look like a cube placed within the scene, rather than a proper reflection. And this is something you'll notice throughout the game. Still, when it comes to the visuals, it has the expected reductions necessary to bring this into VR, but it still looks like Resident Evil Village. The one thing that's becoming clear now is that most of these big games do seem to be settling for 60 frames per second, which quite frankly is a little disappointing. I was really hoping to see some 90 or 120Hz native games on PSVR2 given the immense boost in hardware power. But given the sacrifices that were already made in this game, I suspect that 90 or 120 is simply off the table. Of course, unlike Resident Evil 7, the headset experience is only part of the fun. The Sense controllers and the new interface built around them are far more crucial. Now, as I've mentioned before, Village has been completely overhauled to use hand controls, but I want to lay out how it actually works in practice. So to begin with, each Sense controller acts as one hand, with the capacitive surfaces on those controllers determining the position of your fingers within the game world. Compared to the non-VR mode, which simply relies on button presses to select items and weapons, Village VR instead integrates these features onto your virtual self. The knife, for instance, rests in a sheath attached to your left arm. You simply hold up that arm and grab the knife with your other hand to use it. There's several options related to holding items as well. By default, the hybrid mode requires you to keep the grip button depressed in order to retain the items in your hand. This means if you lose your grip, you'll drop whatever you were holding. Which, if not done well, could have been annoying, but the solution to this problem is rather clever. Once you do drop an item, it will respawn in its original position, so you're not constantly kneeling down to pick up dropped weapons. This has an interesting side effect as well. When you pick up a knife, for instance, you can now throw that knife, breaking objects and injuring enemies in the process. That alone feels great, but due to the item respawn system, you basically have infinite throwing knives in VR. Now, of course, it doesn't do enough damage to enemies to ruin the game balance or anything, but it's a very fun addition, and I love shattering breakables by simply throwing your knife at it. Other weapons are virtually mounted across your invisible torso as well. Your pistol now rests at waist height, for instance, the position and height of which can be adjusted, by the way. You simply reach down, hold the grip button, and now the pistol is in your hand. Each weapon requires actual manipulation to reload as well. On the pistol, for instance, you tap the circle button to eject the magazine, then reach down into your pouch to grab a new one, jam it into the pistol, then pull the slide mechanism. With the shotgun, you'll need to insert each shell one at a time, and after each shot, you'll need to rack the action of the shotgun to eject used shell casings. It feels pretty epic in action. What really elevates this is the extra tension added to combat. When battling a foe, reloading your weapon now requires far more finesse, completely changing the experience.
I love to reload during a battle.
Of course, there are accessibility options available in the menu, so if you don't want to engage with this manual reloading system, you can disable it, but I think it adds a lot to the immersion. Other items you can interact with include the flashlight and first aid potions. To access these, you simply pull open your virtual jacket with one hand, and then grab the item with your other. In the case of the flashlight, it even has 3 separate modes of use. You can toggle the position of your grip or directly attach it to your body like RE7 in VR. Holding the flashlight in one hand and a weapon in the other feels great, that's for sure. Though it's not possible with the shotgun since that weapon requires 2 hands. All of these features wind up feeling comparable to the dedicated VR games like Half-Life Alyx. In fact, the only thing really lacking here are incidental physics interactions. Aside from a handful of specific environmental objects, most items in the world are static and do not react to your hands at all. You can't pick up random bottles or objects in Village, lessening the immersion slightly. That said, they did rework certain puzzles to use hand tracking, like in this scene you need to push this fiery brazier to light torches positioned on either side of the room. You'll also directly interact with inventory items such as keys when unlocking doors or simply opening drawers. In one scene, you can even sit back and try to play some piano. Though unfortunately, only the white keys are actually playable here. Still, it's a nice touch. Even things like the map are represented as actual physical objects within the world now. Heck, the entire inventory system and shop menu has also been modified and is now presented in full 3D with the controllers now behaving as 3D pointers. It feels pretty good. Now, Capcom does include a bunch of other adjustments that you'd expect in any VR game, including the speed, type, and degree of turning, but even still, this is an intense game in VR. If you're prone to motion sickness, it may trigger some queasiness, even on the most gentle of settings. Village also supports both a seated mode and a standing mode, complete with the possibility to use room scale. Speaking of VR settings, I wanted to mention another option directly related to the PSVR2 headset itself, specifically the brightness setting accessible from the PS5 OS menu. So for most games, I've been using the headset at maximum brightness, which can slightly increase the prevalence of persistence blur I found. So turning it down just a couple notches can improve motion clarity. That's kind of general advice. In the case of Resident Evil Village, however, let me suggest something a little more extreme. Try turning the brightness slider to the minimum setting. Okay, so most people probably won't like this, especially right away, and it does crush shadow detail in certain scenes. But in this game, that setting is more effective at boosting the mood than anything else. The game becomes noticeably darker, the flashlight plays a more important role, and the whole thing winds up feeling significantly creepier. Bright scenes are still bright enough, but darker corridors are now bathed in shadow. In this specific game, I really think it's worth a try. At least give it a few minutes and see how it works for you, because once I tried it, I really couldn't go back. It's great stuff. And there's one other headset adjacent element I'd like to mention, the sound. Village makes use of spatial audio to create the impression of a 3-dimensional sound field around the player. As a horror game, audio is exceptionally important to the presentation, and I'm pleased to report that Capcom nailed this aspect. If you want to test it, try this. Stand near an object creating some sort of noise, like a torch, close your eyes, now turn your head back and forth and listen carefully. You should be able to pinpoint the exact location of said object by sound alone. It's really that effective. This is just one more feature that improves immersion. Being chased by an enemy becomes far more frightening thanks to great positional audio. I definitely recommend using headphones with Resident Evil Village. Ultimately though, I think Capcom has done a fantastic job with this update, with just a few caveats here and there. The visual side of things, as I suggested, are extremely faithful to the graphics viewed on a normal TV screen. Yeah, the image quality definitely takes a hit, but compared to RE7 on the PSVR1, it is a true generational leap forward. Heck, if you've mostly only played games on an Oculus Quest, it'll also feel like a gigantic leap. The clarity and sense of place here is seriously engaging. Everything feels far more grandiose and immersive, making it a fantastic way to either revisit the game or play it for the first time. The headset certainly helps a lot in its own right too. The improved comfort and superior head tracking make for a more comfortable and enjoyable experience. But it's the Sense controllers that really steal the show here. The addition of full hand tracking is a true game changer and something that most PSVR1 owners probably never got the chance to experience, at least if they didn't own another headset. The Move wands were simply not a good fit for this sort of design. In this case, I was surprised at how well integrated the VR mode really is. Aside from the lack of physics-driven objects, this actually feels like a game that was built with VR in mind from the beginning, and heck, maybe it was. The most promising aspect here is that this is a standard game that features a super robust VR mode. I don't expect we'll see too many high-budget PSVR2 games owing to the smaller market share, but if developers can produce VR iterations of their games at this level of quality, then I think the PSVR2 becomes a lot more compelling. So yeah, Resident Evil Village is amazing in VR mode, and if you own a headset, you need to give it a shot. It is a significant step up from Resident Evil 7 and really comes alive on the PSVR2. Just a fantastic way to experience the game. But that's going to do it for this video. Hopefully you found it interesting, enjoyable, and informative. And we'll see you next time.